I've been on patrol for several years, and I love stuff like this. That night, I had a backup officer with me. He witnessed everything. Dispatch sent me to a call in a remote mountain area late at night. The caller reported several people holding a baby above their heads, chanting, on her property. The call sounded ridiculous. I smirked as dispatch gave the details. After a long, dark, 20-minute drive along a winding mountain road, I arrived at the address. There wasn't much out here, just trees, silence, and the creeping sense of isolation. No one walks around this deep in the mountains. And at this hour, not a single car in sight. I walked along a gated driveway through a lightly wooded area. The caller's house came into view, dimly lit by just 2 weak lights near the front door. Heavy woods surrounded it on 3 sides, stretching into darkness. Even from a distance, something about the place felt wrong. I stepped onto the patio and knocked on the door. Then, movement. To my left. I froze. Something big, something close. My flashlight cut through the dark, scanning the patio. Nothing. I knocked again. Inside, I heard 2 voices. A man and a woman. That put me at ease. Maybe I imagined the sound outside. After a long pause, the door creaked open. The woman stood there, pale and shaking. Her eyes darted past me into the night. She looked terrified. "Come inside. Please. Close the door." I stepped in. The living room was dim, cluttered, and in the corner, a grainy security monitor flickered. It was a cheap setup, the kind you'd use as a baby monitor, only showing live footage. The camera was aimed at the patio where I'd just been standing. The screen was quiet. Just static and the empty porch. The woman opened her mouth to explain, but I cut her off. "Where's the man?" I asked. She blinked, confused. "What man?" I frowned. "The man I heard inside when I knocked." Her face drained of color. "I'm alone." I didn't believe her. I was certain I heard a man. My partner swept the house. No one was there. The woman finally spoke. "I was sitting on the couch, reading, when I heard something." She pointed at the monitor. I looked up and saw them. 2 people. On my patio. Standing at the door. The knocking started. She called us. I stared at the monitor. The footage was low quality, but clear enough. I could see the patio. The front door. Nothing there. Then, a burst of static. The speakers screamed. All 3 of us went still. The sound blasted through the room, a deep, rushing roar. Like wind. But outside, the trees stood perfectly still. My skin crawled. I turned to the woman. "What is that?" She swallowed hard. "It's them." My partner shifted uncomfortably. He looked ready to leave. The woman handed me her phone. "I took pictures," she whispered. I scrolled through. At first, nothing. Just the empty patio. Then, I stopped. 2 tall, dark figures stood at the door. Featureless. Silent. One of them held something in its arms. My stomach turned. I flipped to the next image. The figure lifted whatever it was above its head. Next image. The object, now on the ground. Both figures loomed over it. My pulse pounded in my ears. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but there wasn't one. My partner and I stepped outside. We searched the yard. The tree line. The patio. Nothing. I hesitated. Then I muttered, "I heard something out here." And that voice inside. "Stop." My partner cut me off. "Just stop talking about it." Back inside, the woman was already grabbing her keys. "I'm going to a hotel," she said. "I'm not staying here." We didn't argue. We walked back to our cars. My partner didn't even hesitate. He jumped into his patrol car and took off. I laughed, but standing there, alone in the dark, I felt watched. A weight sat in the air. Something unseen. Something waiting. I left immediately after. One night, I was on patrol in a two-man car when a disheveled man flagged us down. He stood beside an old Winnebago, eyes darting nervously. "There's a woman inside," he said, voice trembling. "I don't know her. She won't leave." We called it in, then knocked on the door. A young man, his son, let us in. I stepped inside. The woman sat near the cot where the son lay completely still. He looked terrified. She mumbled under her breath, her hands twitching, grasping at nothing. She looked slightly more put together than the son, but I could tell she was either on something or mentally gone. We tried speaking to her. No response. Then, without warning, she bolted out the door. The father and son refused to file a report. They just wanted her gone. We agreed, left the area, and slowly drove away. But about a block down the road, there she was. She walked slowly, aimlessly. I decided to try talking to her again. I pulled up alongside her. My FTO rolled down his window. "What's your name?" She stopped. "Rachel," she mumbled, barely audible. Her hands twitched violently now, and her murmuring grew faster, louder. The only clear thing she said was, "I'm always searching." My FTO kept his voice calm, patient. "Where do you live? Do you need help? Are you hurt?" Nothing. She wouldn't answer. Just fidgeted, mumbled, trembled. And then I felt it. That awful, gut-deep sense that something was wrong. Her eyes. There was something in her eyes. I hadn't spoken, but I knew. I was unsettled. So, I decided to run a little experiment. I didn't say anything aloud. I just mouthed the Lord's Prayer. Silently. The whole time, I stared at her, making sure she wasn't looking at me. She wasn't. And, to make sure she couldn't possibly guess what I was doing, I recited it in Old English. Like Beowulf Old English. Even if she happened to glance at me, there was no way she could recognize it. I reached the words, "Deliver us from evil." And then, Rachel stopped. The murmuring ceased. Her head snapped up. Her eyes went wide. And she stared directly at me. For one long, awful second. Then, she ran, sprinting down the street, vanishing into an alley. Now, I don't know if that was really something supernatural, but for the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. This actually happened to me the other night. I was doing nighttime K-9 training at a local abandoned hospital that is owned by the state. This building is comprised of the old section, which was largely converted to offices, and a newer section, which looks like a standard hospital. We had several guys and their K-9 partners training that night. All of the dogs stayed out in their respective patrol vehicles while they were not being used or trained. For this night, everyone was conducting training in the basement of the newer section of the hospital. They were running scenarios where the dog searches the building, finds a bad guy in a bite suit, and bites the bad guy. My dog wasn't in that stage of his training yet, so I went off to another floor of the hospital with my head trainer to do other training. Myself, my pup, and the head trainer went to the third floor of the building and began training. The hospital had a central area that looked to be a nurse's station. Several long hallways led away from it. I was standing in a hallway with my dog, facing the nurse's station. The hallway continued for about another 40 yards behind me and had multiple rooms. I put my dog in a sit-stay and began listening to the instructions from my trainer. Both my dog and I were focused on what my trainer was saying. While the instruction was going on, my dog suddenly looked back at the hallway behind me. Just as he did this, I heard a deep, mumbled male voice behind me. I interrupted the trainer and turned my head to listen. As I turned my head, the voice faded out. Once the voice faded out, my dog looked forward again. I was a little freaked out at this point. The hospital was locked down tight. We had also walked through to make sure no one was squatting. Even if we had missed a squatter, you would think that multiple announcements. Police K9. Come out now or announce yourself. If not, I'm sending the dog and you'll be bit. Would drive someone out. I believe in ghosts, but I do not think I was hearing the conversation of the other guys training. We were 4 floors away in a large hospital. After this happened, I went looking for the noise and never found anything. I was supervising an evening shift in a small town in rural Australia. We have a large river that snakes its way past the town and runs close to some of the residential areas. It's a kilometer wide in some parts, has steep banks, and has thick bush in the bed when it's dry. One of my crews was tied up with something, and the other was attending to 2 brothers threatening suicide after having a fight at a residence near the bank of the river. I heard about the job and attended to give my crew a hand. Upon arrival, we found one brother who was self-harming and on drugs. We restrained him to prevent him from harming himself. He was telling us he wanted to kill himself and was taken to the hospital via ambulance for mental health. As we had made the apprehension, my crew had to accompany the ambulance for everyone's safety. My crew leaves, and then I'm told by the family that the other brother had run off down the river's dry bank, threatening to hang himself. The family said he was drunk but didn't have anything to actually hang himself with. I was concerned and attended the riverbank near where they thought he went down. Both crews were busy, and I was by myself at night, and it started raining lightly. I parked my unit at the top of the bank with the lights pointed onto the bush, hoping that if he saw my lights, he'd come towards me. I got out my torch and made my way down the bank. I found a small clearing, and a short distance away was thick bush. I heard something moving in the bush. It sounded like something was taking deliberate steps in the bush. I yelled out, thinking it was the guy I was after. I told him I was here to help and pleaded with him to come out. No response. And when I was talking, whatever it was stopped moving. I kept talking, attempting to make contact, as my instincts told me someone was in the thick bush in front of me. No response. My torch couldn't penetrate the bush, but I could hear distinct footfalls. I stopped making any noise, turned off my light, and stood still, listening. I hear movement coming towards me in the bush. I remained still and listened. It came closer. Without thinking, my hand went down to my gun, and I was ready to draw. I turned on my light and walked forward, and heard whatever it was move away from me. I backed off, turned off my light, and remained silent. It started coming closer to me, probing my position. I repeated the exercise once more, and once more it backed off, and came back at a different angle. By this stage, I was on high alert. Something told me to GTFO. I got this heavy, eerie feeling. Any animal that was down there would have run off upon my approach. No animal I know approaches or probes a human's position at night like that. Once I got the overwhelming feeling to leave, I backed off, with my hand on my gun, and I didn't turn my back until I had to climb up the bank. Once at the top and back with my car, I felt a lot better, but I could still hear something moving in the bush. I stayed there for a while as I was curious. I left and conducted inquiries, finding the missing brother on the other side of town, fast asleep, and fine. To this day, I don't know what I ran into down in the riverbed that night.